The year is 1597. Korea is collapsing. Years of war have devastated the country, and Japanese forces are once again pushing forward. Towns have been destroyed. Soldiers are exhausted. And at sea, Korea's navy has suffered a catastrophe. But one man has been ordered back to command. His name is Lee Sun-sin. Only months earlier, he had been imprisoned, stripped of his position, and removed from the fleet he had spent years building. Now he returns to a navy that barely exists. 13 ships. That is all he has. Across the water stands a Japanese fleet many times larger. For Lee Sun-sin, there is no easy retreat. If the Japanese break through, the consequences could reach far beyond the battlefield. His sailors know the numbers. They know what they are facing. And yet he chooses to fight. He takes his 13 ships into the narrow waters of the Myeongyang Strait, where violent currents race between the surrounding shores. Here, numbers may not decide everything. The sea itself might. As the enemy fleet approaches, he watches. He waits. And then the first ships begin to move. What happens next will become one of the most extraordinary naval victories in history. But the Battle of Myeongyang was not the beginning of Lee Sun-sin's story. It was the moment when everything he had endured, failure, political betrayal, imprisonment, and years of war, came down to a single question. Could one commander, with 13 ships, stop an entire fleet? To understand how Lee Sun-sin reached that moment, we have to go back to the beginning. Part 1, The Man Before the Legend. Before Lee Sun-sin became the admiral remembered across Korea, he was simply a determined officer trying to build a career in a military system where talent alone was never enough. He was born in 1545 in Hanseong, the capital of the Joseon dynasty. His family belonged to the Korean scholar official class, but his household was not among the most powerful families at court. He grew up in a society where education, status, and government service were closely connected. Yet his ambitions gradually moved in a different direction. Rather than pursuing the traditional path of a scholar official, chose the military. It was an unusual decision. In Joseon society, military service generally carried less prestige than the civil bureaucracy. But he was drawn toward a life of discipline, training, and responsibility. His path would not be easy. In 1576, at the age of 31, he passed the military examination and entered government service. For Yi, this was the beginning of a long and often frustrating career. His first assignments took him away from the political center of Joseon and into the country's frontier regions, where he dealt with threats from groups along the northern border. There, he developed a reputation for discipline and determination. But he also developed enemies. He was not known for easily compromising when he believed an order was wrong. His stubborn commitment to military responsibility could bring him into conflict with superiors who valued political convenience. And that cost him. At one point, he was punished and demoted after refusing to accept what he regarded as an unjust order. His military career repeatedly moved forward and backward, depending not only on his abilities, but on the politics surrounding him. Yet each setback seemed to reinforce the same characteristic. He kept preparing. He studied military organization. He trained his men. He paid attention to equipment and logistics. And when he was given responsibility, he took it seriously. By 1591, he had risen to an important position. He was appointed commander of the left Jeolla Naval District, responsible for a major section of Korea's southern coastline. The timing was extraordinary. Across the sea, Japan had recently been unified under Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi had spent years bringing Japan's competing warlords under his authority. Now he was looking beyond the islands. His ambitions extended toward Korea and, ultimately, China. Korean officials received warnings that a Japanese invasion might be coming. But Joseon was not fully prepared for what that invasion would mean. The country had enjoyed decades without a major war on its own soil. Its military institutions had weakened in some areas, and political divisions made preparation difficult. He approached the danger differently. He inspected ships. He organized crews. He improved readiness. He prepared weapons and supplies. He also studied the coastline around him. These preparations would soon become crucial. Because in April 1592, Japan launched its invasion. Thousands of soldiers crossed the sea and landed in southern Korea. The scale of the attack quickly became apparent. Japanese armies advanced with experienced troops, modern firearms, and commanders hardened by decades of civil war. Korean land forces struggled to stop them. The invasion moved north. And while armies fought for control of Korean cities and roads, another battle was beginning to take shape offshore. Lee Sun-sin now faced the responsibility he had spent years preparing for. His fleet stood between the Japanese invasion force and the sea routes that connected its armies to Japan. For the first time, the officer who had spent much of his career fighting through setbacks was about to command in a war that would determine the fate of his country. The years of preparation were over. Now the sea would decide what happened next. Part 2, When War Came. In the spring of 1592, the threat that Korea had feared finally arrived. A massive Japanese invasion force crossed the sea and landed on the Korean Peninsula. The invasion was led under the authority of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the ruler who had unified much of Japan and now sought to expand his power onto the Asian mainland. The Japanese army advanced with extraordinary speed. Cities fell. Korean forces were pushed back. Seoul was captured, and the royal court was forced to flee north. For Joseon Korea, the situation was becoming a national emergency. But the war was not being decided only on land. The sea was becoming just as important. Japan depended on its ability to move soldiers, weapons, food, and supplies across the Korea Strait and along the Korean coastline. If Japanese forces could maintain control of the sea, their armies could continue receiving reinforcements. But if their naval supply routes were disrupted, the entire invasion would become more difficult to sustain. This was where Lee Sun-sin entered the war. As commander of the left Jeolla Naval District, he was responsible for protecting a strategically important section of Korea's southern coast. He had spent years preparing for the possibility of conflict. His forces trained regularly. Ships were repaired and maintained. Weapons were prepared. Coastal waters were studied carefully. And he paid close attention to something that was often overlooked in warfare: information. He needed to know where the enemy was, how its ships moved, what the coastline offered, and how wind, currents, islands, and narrow passages could influence a battle. When the Japanese fleet appeared, he did not rush into battle simply because an enemy had arrived. He looked for the right conditions. His first major victory came at Okpo in June 1592. Yi's fleet attacked a Japanese force gathered near the port and destroyed or captured a significant number of enemy vessels while suffering comparatively few losses. It was an important victory, but Yi understood that one successful engagement would not decide the war. More battles followed. At Sacheon, his fleet confronted Japanese ships in difficult coastal waters. Here, Yi employed concentrated firepower and carefully controlled movement to disrupt the enemy formation. The Korean ships were not simply charging forward. They were maneuvering. They were maintaining formation. They were using distance and positioning to make Japanese boarding tactics more difficult. This distinction mattered. Japanese naval warfare of the period often placed considerable emphasis on close combat and boarding. Korean commanders, under Yi's leadership, increasingly sought to prevent the enemy from turning a naval engagement into a fight at close quarters. Their ships could attack from a distance with cannon fire and then withdraw or reposition before the enemy could fully exploit its strengths. Yi was developing a system. And that system reached its most famous expression at the Battle of Hansando in August 1592. The Japanese fleet entered waters near Hansando Island, where he was able to use the geography to his advantage. His forces employed a formation often associated with the Korean Navy known as the crane wing formation, spreading the fleet in a curved arrangement designed to envelop the opposing force. The exact appearance and execution of the formation have been debated by historians, but the larger principle is clear. He wanted to control the battlefield before the battle controlled him. He selected the location. He managed the distance. He coordinated his ships. And he concentrated fire on the enemy fleet while limiting the opportunities for Japanese vessels to close in. The result was a major Korean victory. Hansando was more than another successful battle. It demonstrated that Japanese naval forces could be stopped. And it helped protect Korean sea routes at a critical moment in the invasion. There was also another weapon associated with Yi's fleet that would later become one of the most famous symbols of Korean military history, the turtle ship, or geobuxian. The basic concept was not entirely new. Armored or covered warships had existed in Korea before Yi's time, and the exact design of the vessels used during the Imjin War remains uncertain. Later accounts describe ships with a covered deck, defensive features, and weapons that allowed them to attack enemy formations while making boarding more difficult. But the turtle ship was not a magical machine that won battles by itself. Its importance came from the way it was used within Yi's larger naval system. The ships worked together. Reconnaissance identified the enemy. Commanders chose favorable waters. Formations controlled movement. Cannon fire disrupted opposing ships. And disciplined crews carried out orders under pressure. Yi Sun-sin was not simply building better ships. He was building a better way to fight at sea. By the middle of 1592, his victories had made him one of Korea's most important military commanders. But success on the battlefield did not protect him from the politics of the Joseon court. The greatest threat to Yi's command would soon come from somewhere he could not defeat with cannons. It would come from within his own country. Part 3, The Fall of an Admiral. Yi Sun-sin's victories had made him indispensable on the battlefield. But they had not made him untouchable. In Joseon Korea, military success existed within a political system where rival factions competed for influence at court. Commanders were expected to obey orders, even when those orders came from officials far removed from the battlefield. And Yi was not a commander who easily accepted decisions he believed would endanger his forces. By 1596 and 1597, the war had entered a complicated and increasingly unstable phase. The first Japanese invasion had failed to achieve its original objectives, and negotiations followed. But the peace talks eventually collapsed. In 1597, Japan launched a second major invasion of Korea. This time, the Korean court faced an even more dangerous situation. Japanese forces were preparing to move again along the southern coast, and the Korean Navy was expected to stop them. But Yi became caught in a political struggle surrounding intelligence about the Japanese fleet. Korean officials ordered him to move against Japanese forces at a particular moment and location. Yi did not carry out the order. The precise circumstances remain debated, but the basic outcome is clear. The court turned against him. Yi was removed from his position as naval commander, arrested, and taken to Seoul. For a commander who had spent years defending the country, the humiliation was severe. He was imprisoned and subjected to punishment. His position was taken by Won Jae-un, another senior Korean naval commander. The consequences soon became catastrophic. In August 1597, the Korean fleet under Won Jae-un confronted a much larger Japanese naval force near Chilcheollyang. The Korean Navy was defeated. The fleet that Yi had spent years building was effectively destroyed. Thousands of sailors and soldiers were lost, and only a small number of Korean warships survived. The strategic consequences were enormous. Korea had lost much of the naval force that protected its southern waters. The Japanese could once again move troops and supplies by sea with far less resistance. And suddenly, the government that had removed Yi needed him again. He was restored to command. But the admiral who returned was facing a situation almost unimaginable compared with the one he had left behind. The fleet was gone. The country was exhausted. Japanese armies were advancing again. And he had very little with which to rebuild Korea's naval defenses. Yet he immediately began assessing what remained. 13 warships were available to him. That number would become one of the defining facts of his story. But the number alone does not explain how desperate the situation really was. A fleet of 13 ships could not simply meet a vastly larger enemy fleet in open water and expect discipline to erase the difference. He needed something else. He needed geography. He needed timing. And above all, he needed to prevent the Japanese from using their numerical superiority in the way they expected. The solution would lead him to the narrow waters of Myeongyang. There, powerful currents moved through a dangerous strait between islands and the Korean mainland. He studied the waters carefully. He understood that a battlefield did not have to be an open ocean. A narrow channel could restrict movement. Strong currents could disrupt formations. And a commander who controlled the position could force a larger fleet into conditions where its numbers became harder to use. But first came the psychological problem. His sailors knew how badly the Korean Navy had been defeated at Chilcheollyang. They knew how many ships had been lost. They knew what they were facing. He could not simply give them more ships. He had to restore their confidence in the fleet they still possessed. And then he had to take those 13 vessels into one of the most dangerous naval engagements of the entire war. In October 1597, the Japanese fleet approached Myeongyang. He was waiting. He had almost nothing left. But he still had a fleet. And he had chosen the battlefield. The next battle would test whether that was enough. Part 4, 13 ships. By the autumn of 1597, Sun-sin's situation had become almost impossible. The Korean Navy had been devastated at Chilcheollyang. The ships that remained were few. The Japanese invasion was advancing again. And he had been given command of what was left, 13 warships. 13. Across the water was a Japanese naval force vastly larger than his own. The exact numbers recorded in historical sources vary, particularly regarding how many Japanese vessels actually took part in the fighting at Myeongyang. Later Korean accounts traditionally describe an enormous Japanese fleet, sometimes giving figures well above 100 ships. But whatever the precise number, the imbalance was severe. He could not defeat the Japanese by meeting them on equal terms. So he refused to give them an equal battlefield. He moved toward Myeongyang Strait, a narrow passage between the Korean mainland and Jindo Island. The location mattered. The waters were shaped by powerful tidal currents that could rapidly change direction and speed. For a large fleet, this could become a serious problem. Ships could lose formation. Distances could change unexpectedly. A vessel that appeared to be advancing could suddenly find itself struggling against the current. He understood the water. He also understood the psychology of his own fleet. His sailors had witnessed the destruction of the Korean Navy. Many had every reason to fear what was coming. So he positioned himself at the center of the formation and prepared to meet the enemy. The Japanese fleet entered the strait. The water began to move. At first, the Korean ships faced an enormous disadvantage. Yi's vessels were heavily outnumbered, and the Japanese had enough ships to threaten the Korean line from multiple directions. But the narrow channel prevented the Japanese from simply spreading their entire force across the battlefield. Only part of the fleet could engage effectively at any one moment. This changed the mathematics of the battle. Instead of 13 ships fighting an entire fleet simultaneously, he could concentrate his available strength against portions of the Japanese force as they entered the dangerous waters. The currents added another layer of uncertainty. Yi's ships maintained their positions as long as possible, using artillery and disciplined maneuvering to keep the Japanese at a distance. The battle became a contest of control. Who could maintain formation? Who could exploit the water? Who could force the other side into a mistake? The Japanese ships continued forward. But the strait worked against them. Their numerical superiority was real, yet difficult to deploy all at once. Yi's fleet used the restricted waters to concentrate its firepower. And then the current began to change. The conditions that had favored one side could quickly favor the other. This was the danger of Myeongyang. The battlefield itself was constantly moving. For Yi, preparation was therefore not about predicting every second of the battle. It was about understanding the environment well enough to recognize when an opportunity appeared. As the fighting continued, Japanese ships struggled to maintain an effective formation in the narrow waterway. The Korean force resisted. The battle was chaotic, but Yi's command structure remained disciplined. That discipline mattered. A larger fleet is only useful when its ships can operate effectively together. At Myeongyang, the geography prevented the Japanese from making full use of their numbers. And gradually, the balance began to shift. The Japanese fleet withdrew. The Korean Navy had survived. More than survived. It had achieved one of the most remarkable victories of the Imjin War. Myeongyang became famous because of the apparent contradiction at its center. A tiny Korean force had confronted a vastly larger Japanese fleet in a confined and dangerous stretch of water and emerged victorious. But the real achievement was more complicated than the simple story of 13 ships defeating an enormous armada. Yi did not make the numerical disadvantage disappear. He found a way to make it less decisive. He used reconnaissance. He understood the coastline. He selected his position carefully. He studied the currents. He maintained discipline when fear could have broken the fleet apart. And he understood that naval warfare was not simply about the number of ships. It was about where those ships could move, when they could move, and how effectively they could fight together. Myeongyang also bought Korea something it desperately needed: time. The Japanese had failed to destroy the Korean Navy. Their control of the surrounding waters remained contested. And he once again demonstrated that the Korean Navy could still influence the course of the war. But victory did not mean peace. The Japanese invasion continued. The war would last into the following year. And Yi Sun-sin's greatest battle was still ahead of him. At Myeongyang, he had fought with almost nothing. At Noryang, he would fight in the final campaign of his life. Part 5, The Last Battle. After Myeongyang, the war entered its final phase. The Japanese invasion had failed to achieve its larger objectives, but the conflict was not yet finished. Japanese forces still held positions in southern Korea, and the struggle for control of the coastline continued. For Yi Sun-sin, the situation had changed once again. He had rebuilt his naval forces after the disaster at Chilcheollyang. With the support of Ming Chinese forces and other Korean commanders, the Allied forces were now preparing for another major campaign. Then, in 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi died in Japan. His death transformed the strategic situation. The Japanese leadership ordered its armies to withdraw from Korea. But withdrawing tens of thousands of soldiers from a hostile country was not simple. The Japanese needed their remaining coastal strongholds and naval forces to protect the evacuation. Yi Sun-sin understood the opportunity. If the Japanese could withdraw their forces safely, they could return to Japan with much of their military strength intact. The Korean and Ming forces therefore moved to interfere with the withdrawal. This led to the Battle of Noryang in December 1598. It would become the final major naval battle of the Imjin War. He commanded Korean ships alongside Ming naval forces under Chunlin. The battle unfolded in the waters around Noryang Strait, where the Allied fleet confronted Japanese forces attempting to break through and escape. Once again, Yi relied on coordination, positioning, and concentrated firepower. But Noryang was different from the battles that had come before. This was no longer a war that Yi was trying to turn around. The Japanese were leaving. The objective was to prevent their withdrawal from becoming an organized escape. The fighting became intense. Korean, Ming, and Japanese ships maneuvered through the darkness and confusion of the battle. The Allied forces pressed the Japanese fleet, while Japanese ships attempted to break through the blockade. Yi remained at the center of the fighting. Then, during the battle, he was fatally wounded. The circumstances are recorded differently in later accounts, but the essential fact is certain: he was struck by enemy fire and knew that his wound was mortal. And yet, according to the historical tradition surrounding his final moments, he was concerned that news of his death could damage the morale of his sailors while the battle was still underway. His death was kept from the fleet until the fighting had reached its conclusion. The battle ended in an Allied victory, and the Japanese withdrawal from Korea was completed. The war was over. After 7 years of invasion, devastation, political conflict, and enormous loss, Japan's forces had failed to conquer Korea. Yi Sun-sin did not live to see the full consequences of that victory. He died at the age of 53. But the story of his career had already become extraordinary. He had entered military service without the political power of the great families at court. He had suffered setbacks and punishment. He had risen to command during the most dangerous war Korea had faced in generations. He had defeated Japanese naval forces repeatedly in 1592. He had survived imprisonment and the destruction of the fleet he once commanded. He had returned with only 13 ships. And at Myeongyang, he had transformed geography, timing, and discipline into a weapon powerful enough to stop a much larger force. At Noryang, he fought his final battle knowing that the war itself was nearing its end. His legacy, however, is not simply a list of victories. Yi's greatest strength was preparation. He did not wait for battle to begin before thinking about how to win it. He studied the coastline before the enemy arrived. He understood his ships and their limitations. He trained his crews. He gathered intelligence. He adapted his tactics to the environment. And when circumstances changed, he changed with them. The famous turtle ships were only one part of that system. The real weapon was the fleet itself, organized, informed, disciplined, and commanded by an officer who understood that naval warfare was about far more than courage. It was about decisions made before the first shot was fired. That may be why Yi Sun-sin's story has endured for centuries. His victories were extraordinary. But they were not miracles. They were the result of preparation meeting opportunity, again and again, in a war where failure could have changed the fate of an entire country. And at Noryang, the admiral who had spent years defending Korea finally paid the ultimate price for that commitment. The war ended. The ships returned. And Yi Sun-sin was gone. But the reputation he had built on the waters of Korea was only beginning.